In the middle of the night, a low, painful groan echoes through the barn as the cow suddenly collapses once again. Emma is by her side in an instant, her heart racing as she watches the animal struggle to breathe. The sound of the cow's labored gasps fills the quiet night, and Emma can feel her own chest tightening in panic. She calls out to John, her voice cracking with fear, but there's no answer. She grabs his arm and shakes him awake, her hands trembling. "John, she's gone down again. She's not getting up." Emma's voice rises in terror as she watches the cow's body sag, her eyes wild with fear. John rushes to her side, but the uncertainty of the situation weighs heavily on both of them. Will she survive the night? The air feels thick with dread, and neither of them knows what to do next. It's the longest, most uncertain night they've ever faced. Chapter 1. An ordinary day with an unexpected beginning. The morning sun rose lazily over the horizon, casting a golden glow over John and Emma's small farm. The crisp air smelled of fresh hay and damp earth, a familiar and comforting scent that signaled the start of another busy day. John stretched his aching back as he stepped onto the wooden porch, a steaming mug of coffee in his weathered hands. Emma was already up and about, her light footsteps barely making a sound on the dewy grass as she made her way to the chicken coop. "Morning, love," John called out, watching as Emma carefully lifted the latch to the coop's wooden gate. "Morning," she replied, her voice warm and filled with the usual quiet joy of their daily routine. Their farm was small but lively, home to a variety of animals that made every day a challenge and an adventure. 2 cows, a few pigs, a flock of geese, a growing family of rabbits, and, of course, their chickens and ducks. John finished his coffee and set the mug on the porch railing before heading toward the barn. The animals needed their morning feed, and he had long since learned that a hungry animal was a restless animal. He grabbed a bucket of grain, scattering it across the ground for the chickens and ducks before filling the trough for the cows. Everything seemed peaceful until Emma's worried voice called out. The first signs of trouble. "John, something's not right with the ducks." John turned, wiping his hands on his worn-out jeans, and made his way over. Emma stood by the duck enclosure, her brow furrowed as she observed the birds. "They're acting strange," she said, nodding toward the flock. John leaned on the wooden fence, watching the ducks waddle around. At first glance, they seemed normal, quacking, shaking their feathers, moving about the enclosure. But then he noticed it. Their movements were tense, erratic. Instead of lazily paddling in their pond or pecking at the ground, they were aggressively flapping their wings, pecking at each other, and, most disturbingly, chasing the smaller chicks that wandered too close. "That's odd," John muttered. "Ducks don't usually bother with the chicks." Emma crossed her arms. "They didn't used to, but this morning, I saw one of them snap at a chick. If I hadn't stepped in, it could have been worse." John frowned. Ducks were usually calm, social birds, but something had changed overnight. "Maybe they're just hungry," he suggested. "I'll give them a little extra feed." Emma wasn't convinced, but she nodded. They had been tending animals long enough to know that odd behavior usually meant something deeper was wrong. The chase begins. An hour later, after tending to the cows and pigs, John returned to the duck enclosure, only to find Emma frantically waving her arms, trying to shoo the ducks away from the chicks. "Get back! Shoo! John, help me!" John rushed forward, just in time to see one of the ducks lunge at a small, fluffy chick. The little creature let out a terrified chirp and darted away, only for another duck to chase after it. The scene was chaotic, chicks running in all directions, Emma trying to block the ducks, and John realizing that this wasn't just a random scuffle. One of the larger ducks, a drake with dark, glossy feathers, flared its wings and let out a loud, angry quack before charging at a chick near the fence. "Enough of this," John growled, stepping into the enclosure. He grabbed a nearby wooden stick and gently used it to herd the ducks away from the chicks. Emma bent down and scooped up the terrified little bird, holding it close to her chest. John could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't normal. Ducks weren't predators, not like this. "We need to separate them," Emma said, stroking the chick's trembling body. "At least for now." John nodded. I'll set up a temporary fence. A sudden attack. Just as he turned to leave, one of the ducks, the same aggressive drake from earlier, let out a sharp cry and launched itself forward, straight at the chick in Emma's arms. Emma gasped and stepped back, barely dodging the furious bird. John reacted quickly, grabbing the drake midair and holding it back. The duck flapped wildly, its wings beating against his arms, its beak snapping. "Easy now," John muttered, tightening his grip. He had dealt with aggressive animals before, but never a duck acting like this. Emma looked shaken. She cradled the chick closer, whispering soothing words to calm it down. John carefully released the drake back into the enclosure, watching as it ruffled its feathers angrily before retreating. "This isn't normal," Emma said, her voice firm. John exhaled slowly. "No, it isn't." They exchanged a look. They had faced many farm problems before. Sick animals, broken fences, bad weather. But this was something new. The ducks were changing, and they had no idea why. And worse, this wasn't the end of it. End of chapter 1. John stood by the fence, watching the ducks closely. If they didn't figure this out soon, things could get a lot worse. Chapter 2. The first trouble, the ducks declare war. The morning sun had barely risen when John and Emma found themselves back at the duck enclosure, watching their once docile birds waddle around like tiny, feathered tyrants. The tension from the previous day still lingered, and both of them knew that whatever had caused this shift in behavior wasn't going to disappear overnight. John leaned on the fence, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "We need to figure out what's gotten into them." Emma stood beside him, arms crossed, her eyes scanning the ducks with suspicion. "They weren't always like this. Something changed." John nodded. He had spent enough years tending animals to know that aggression usually had a cause. Illness, hunger, stress, or even a change in the environment. But what could have triggered this sudden hostility? He watched as the drake, the same one that had attacked the chick yesterday, strutted around like a general leading his troops. The other ducks followed his lead, pecking at the ground, flapping their wings, and eyeing the smaller animals with a sharp, almost predatory interest. Emma sighed, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "We can't let this go on, John. If they keep attacking the chicks, we're going to lose them." John ran a hand through his graying hair. "Let's watch them a little longer. Maybe we'll catch what's triggering it." A morning battle begins. They didn't have to wait long. As John and Emma stood by, a small, golden-feathered chick wandered too close to the duck enclosure. In an instant, the drake let out a sharp quack and charged. The other ducks followed, their webbed feet slapping against the muddy ground as they lunged at the tiny bird. Emma gasped. "No, no, no!" John reacted instinctively, grabbing a wooden rake and rushing forward. He swung it gently but firmly, using it to push the ducks back. The birds squawked in protest, but the moment John stepped away, they tried again. Emma quickly scooped up the chick, holding it protectively against her chest. She could feel the poor thing trembling. "This is madness," John muttered, stepping in front of the ducks as they quacked angrily, their little eyes burning with some newfound defiance. The scene felt almost surreal. Ducks weren't supposed to behave like this. They were farm birds, not predators. "All right," John said, breathless. "That's enough. We need a plan. A chick in peril." The chicks were in danger, that much was clear. And as Emma cradled the frightened little one in her hands, she realized something even worse. One of its tiny wings was injured. "Oh, John, it's hurt," she said, her voice thick with worry. John's face darkened. He leaned in, inspecting the chick carefully. The wing wasn't broken, but it was bleeding slightly where a duck's beak had grabbed at it. Emma clutched the chick closer. "I'm taking it inside. I'll clean the wound and keep it warm." John exhaled, watching her hurry toward the house. He turned back to the ducks, who now stood silently, watching him as if daring him to make the next move. Something had to be done. Seeking advice from the neighbors. By afternoon, John and Emma decided to visit their nearest neighbor, an old farmer named Tom, who had been raising ducks longer than anyone in town. If anyone knew what was going on, it was him. Tom greeted them with a warm smile and a knowing look. "Let me guess," he said, leaning on his cane. Your ducks are turning into little monsters? Emma blinked in surprise. You've seen this before? Tom nodded. Happens every once in a while. Could be a few things, lack of food, changes in the flock, or sometimes it's just their instincts kicking in. If they feel threatened or territorial, they can get mean real fast. John frowned. But nothing's changed. We feed them the same, take care of them the same. Tom scratched his head. Could be hormonal. If you've got a strong drake, sometimes he'll rile up the others. They get too dominant and start attacking anything smaller than them. Emma exchanged a worried glance with John. So what do we do? Tom shrugged. You got two options. Separate them or get rid of the aggressive ones. John sighed. We're not getting rid of them. We'll try moving them first. Tom nodded. Smart choice. Just make sure they can't get back to the chicks. A temporary solution, or so they thought. That evening, John built a new temporary enclosure further away from the main barn. The ducks had plenty of space, food, and water, everything they could possibly need. We'll see if this helps, John said, wiping sweat from his brow as he and Emma stepped back to admire their work. Emma watched as the ducks settled into their new space, seeming calmer now that they were separated from the chicks. Maybe this will do the trick, she murmured, though a small seed of doubt lingered in her mind. That night, as they locked up the barn and made their way back to the house, the farm was peaceful. The stars twinkled above, and the only sounds were the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional moo from one of their cows. John and Emma finally allowed themselves to relax, but they shouldn't have. End of chapter 2. Because when they woke up the next morning, the ducks were back. Somehow they had escaped. Chapter 3. The second trouble, the cow falls to the ground. The morning began as usual, with John and Emma tending to their animals, though the events of the previous night still weighed on their minds. The ducks had somehow escaped from their enclosure, finding their way back to the chicks. John had spent a good hour rounding them up again, but at least, for now, they were contained. Still, something felt off. There was a strange tension in the air, as if the farm itself was bracing for something worse, and it didn't take long for that feeling to turn into reality. Signs of trouble. It was during the late morning feeding when John first noticed something unusual about Belka, one of their two cows. She was usually the liveliest of the pair, always the first to the trough, nudging John playfully whenever he brought her food. But today, she stood motionless in the pasture, her ears drooping, eyes half-lidded, and her tail barely swishing at the flies. Emma, John called, narrowing his eyes. Come take a look at Belka. Emma wiped her hands on her apron and walked over. The moment she saw the cow's dull eyes and sluggish posture, her stomach twisted. She doesn't look right, Emma said, reaching out to touch Belka's thick, warm hide. She was breathing heavily, her nostrils flaring slightly with each exhale. John frowned. She ate less than usual this morning. I thought maybe she just wasn't hungry, but Belka let out a low, strained moo and took a shaky step forward, then stopped as if the effort was too much. A bad feeling settled in John's gut. We should keep an eye on her, he said. If she's not better by evening, we call the vet. Emma nodded, though worry had already settled deep in her chest. A sudden collapse. By the time the sun began to set, John's concern turned into alarm. He was in the barn fixing the latch on the rabbit hutch when he heard a loud, heavy thud from the pasture. His heart skipped a beat. He knew that sound. He dropped his tools and ran outside, Emma following close behind. Belka was on the ground. She lay on her side, her massive body motionless except for her heaving chest. Her legs twitched weakly, as if she was trying to stand but couldn't. Her eyes, usually so full of gentle warmth, were wide and unfocused. John rushed to her side. Come on, girl, he murmured, kneeling next to her. Get up now. He pressed his hands against her side, feeling the rapid, shallow rise and fall of her breath. She was still alive, but something was very, very wrong. Emma covered her mouth with her hands. John, what's happening to her? John had seen a lot in his years on the farm, but this was different. He had no idea what was going on, and that terrified him. We're calling the vet. Now. The long wait. John didn't waste a second. He sprinted back to the house, grabbed the phone, and dialed the number of their trusted veterinarian, Dr. Lawson. "Doc, it's Belka," John said the moment the vet picked up. "She collapsed. Can't get up. Breathing's off." There was no hesitation in Dr. Lawson's voice. "I'll be there as soon as I can. Keep her calm. Try to keep her warm." John hung up and rushed back outside. Emma had already grabbed an old blanket, draping it over Belka's side to keep the night chill from seeping into her body. The cow let out another low, pained sound, her sides shuddering. Emma knelt beside her, stroking her broad head. "You'll be okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though fear made her voice tremble. John stood beside them, his fists clenched at his sides. He hated feeling helpless. All they could do now was wait. A grim diagnosis. Dr. Lawson arrived half an hour later, his truck kicking up dust as it sped down the dirt road. He jumped out, grabbed his medical bag, and hurried toward Belka. Without wasting a second, he knelt beside the cow and began his examination. He checked her eyes, listened to her breathing, pressed gently against her stomach. His experienced hands moved quickly, his face unreadable. John and Emma held their breath. After a long, tense silence, Dr. Lawson sat back on his heels, his expression grave. "It's not good," he said. "I suspect intestinal blockage." Emma's heart sank. She had heard of it before. A dangerous condition where food gets stuck in the intestines, causing deadly complications if not treated quickly. John swallowed hard. "What do we do?" The vet hesitated. "If it is a blockage, she needs surgery. Soon. Otherwise, she won't make it through the night." Emma's breath hitched. "Surgery?" Dr. Lawson nodded. "I can perform it, but it's risky. She's weak, and there's no guarantee she'll pull through." John looked down at Belka, her huge body still and trembling beneath the blanket. She had been with them for years. More than just a farm animal, she was part of their family. The thought of losing her was unbearable. "We'll do it," he said firmly. "We have to try." Dr. Lawson gave a curt nod. "I'll get my equipment, but we need to move fast." End of chapter 3. As Dr. Lawson rushed to his truck, Emma and John remained by Belka's side, their hands resting gently on her head. The night air was cold, their breath visible in the dim glow of the barn light. And as Belka let out another labored breath, John and Emma could only wonder, would she make it through till morning? Chapter 4. The Battle for Belka. The night air was thick with tension as Dr. Lawson rolled up his sleeves and knelt beside Belka. The barn smelled of hay, damp earth, and the faint metallic tang of fear, both from the humans and the struggling animal. John and Emma had seen many hardships in their years of farming, but this was different. This was life and death, and the battle was just beginning. The fight begins. "Emma, I need you to keep her head steady," Dr. Lawson instructed as he pulled out a long rubber tube from his medical bag. "John, be ready to hold her still if she thrashes." Emma knelt by Belka's head, stroking her broad forehead, whispering soothing words, though her own hands trembled. "Easy, sweetheart. We're here. We're going to help you." The cow let out a weak, distressed groan, her eyes glassy with exhaustion. Dr. Lawson worked swiftly, measuring out a dose of mineral oil and preparing to insert the tube down her throat. "If this is a blockage, we need to lubricate her insides and try to break it up before considering surgery." John nodded, though the sight of the thick, coiled tube made his stomach twist. This wasn't going to be easy, a struggle for survival. The moment Dr. Lawson began inserting the tube, Belka's body jerked in protest. A desperate surge of energy coursed through her as she thrashed her head, nearly knocking Emma backward. "Hold her," Dr. Lawson barked. John lunged forward, gripping Belka's side, using all his strength to keep her from rolling over. Emma tightened her hold around the cow's head, pressing her cheek against Belka's warm fur. "Sho girl," she murmured. I know. Just hold on." Belka struggled, but slowly, she began to tire, her movements weakening. Dr. Lawson took the chance to push the tube further in, carefully guiding it down her throat. John watched with gritted teeth as the vet poured the mineral oil down the tube, hoping it would help dissolve whatever was blocking her insides. Minutes felt like hours. The cow let out deep, ragged breaths, her flanks rising and falling in uneven rhythm. Emma wiped her forehead, exhaustion weighing down on her shoulders. "Is it working?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Lawson exhaled. "We won't know yet. We need to give it time to move through her system." But time was the one thing they didn't have. An old trick from the past. John paced the barn, his mind racing, watching Belka suffer, feeling helpless. It was unbearable. There had to be another way. Then, a memory surfaced. His grandfather had once told him about a method they used back in the old days, one that could help a cow release the blockage before it was too late. It was risky, but at this point, what choice did they have? "Lawson," John said, turning back to the vet. "What if we get her moving?" Dr. Lawson arched an eyebrow. "She can't even stand." "Not on her own, no," John admitted. "But I've seen this done before. If we get her up, force her to take a few steps, maybe, just maybe, it'll help shift whatever's stuck." Emma's eyes widened. "John, she's weak. What if we make it worse?" John swallowed. "And what if we do nothing?" A heavy silence fell between them. Then Dr. Lawson nodded. "It's a long shot, but it might just work." A desperate attempt. It took everything John and Dr. Lawson had to hoist Belka onto her feet. Emma pulled a rope around her torso, using it as leverage to help lift her. The cow let out a pained groan but didn't fight as much as before. She was too exhausted. "Come on, girl," John grunted, straining against her weight. Just a few steps. Belka swayed, her legs trembling beneath her. The first step was a stumble. The second, hesitant but stronger. By the third, something changed. A deep, rumbling sound came from within her belly. Then another. Emma gasped. "John, listen." John didn't just listen, he felt it. A shift inside her, a movement that hadn't been there before. Dr. Lawson pressed a hand against her side. "It's working. Whatever was stuck is moving." John let out a breath of relief, his arms shaking from exertion. Then, without warning, Belka let out a deep, rolling belch, followed by a long, low moo. It was weak, but it was there. "That's a good sign," Dr. Lawson said, a small smile creeping onto his face. "If she can start passing gas, she's got a chance." Emma nearly collapsed from relief, pressing a hand to her chest. "Oh, thank heavens," the vet's final warning. As Belka settled back down onto the hay, her breathing slower and more even, Dr. Lawson packed up his supplies. "She's not out of danger yet," he warned. "Tonight will be crucial. If she worsens again, call me immediately. But if she keeps improving, she might just pull through." John nodded solemnly. "We'll watch her all night if we have to." Emma knelt beside Belka, stroking her head once more. "You're strong, girl. You'll get through this." The cow let out another weak but steady breath, her eyelids drooping in exhaustion. For the first time that night, hope filled the barn. End of chapter 4. But just as John and Emma allowed themselves to breathe, a sudden, heavy thud shattered the silence. Belka had collapsed again. And this time, the deep, guttural moan that escaped her sent ice through Emma's veins. "No, no, no!" Emma cried, her voice breaking. John spun around, his heart pounding. Was she slipping away after all? Chapter 5. A nighttime miracle and a new shock. The night stretched on like an eternity. The only sounds in the barn were the steady rustling of hay, the occasional sigh from the sleeping animals, and Belka's weak but persistent breathing. John sat beside her, his old bones aching from the long hours on the cold wooden floor, but he refused to leave her side. A vigil by the cow. He stroked her coarse hide gently, whispering words of encouragement. "Come on, girl. You've made it this far," he murmured. "You've got a good life here. Emma and we need you." Belka's large, dark eyes blinked slowly, her breath steady but weak. She wasn't fighting anymore, not like before. John didn't know if that was a good sign or not. Emma dozed off in the hay for a few hours but woke at every small noise, glancing worriedly at the cow. The hours crawled. Midnight passed. Then 1, then 2. John watched the slow rise and fall of Belka's belly, listening closely for any change. The barn lantern cast long shadows on the walls, and for the first time in years, John found himself muttering a quiet prayer. Then, just as dawn began to tint the sky a pale blue, Belka let out a deep, low sigh and moved. A slow rise. John's tired eyes snapped open as he saw her shifting. "Emma," he called, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Emma scrambled to her feet just in time to see Belka plant her front hooves into the hay and push herself up. It wasn't graceful. Her legs wobbled like a newborn calf's, but she was moving. Slowly, painfully. She got her hind legs beneath her and, with a great effort, she stood. John let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Emma clutched her chest, tears in her eyes. "Oh, Belka, you did it, girl." The cow stood there, swaying slightly but steady, her ears twitching. She took a slow step, then another. John exhaled deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. "That's my girl." Dr. Lawson would still need to check on her. But for now, relief washed over them both like a warm tide. A quiet morning, or so they thought. Emma wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll go make us some breakfast. You stay with her a bit longer." John nodded, stretching his stiff limbs. "Yeah, I'll keep an eye on her." Emma turned and made her way toward the house, exhaustion finally easing in her chest. The sky was brightening, the world waking up. The nightmare was over, or so she thought. A sudden crash. As Emma stepped into the kitchen, she sighed in relief. The familiar scent of home wrapped around her. The faint smell of dried herbs hanging by the window, the warmth of the old wooden stove. She had just reached for the kettle when, bang! A deafening crash shattered the morning silence. Emma spun around just as something massive came hurtling through the window. Glass exploded in all directions, shards clattering against the wooden floor. A gust of freezing morning air swept into the room, and in the middle of it, a massive eagle. Emma barely had time to react before the bird, its wings nearly as wide as the doorway, flapped violently, knocking plates and jars off the shelves. Feathers and dust filled the air. Emma screamed, the eagle's wrath. The bird, likely as shocked as she was, let out a piercing screech and flailed wildly, its talons scraping against the wooden table. Emma stumbled backward, shielding her face as the eagle knocked over a chair. The room was a whirlwind of chaos. Jars shattering, flour bursting into the air in white clouds. And then, crash! The eagle's powerful wings slammed into the shelf above the fireplace, sending a heavy, antique oil lamp flying off the edge. Time seemed to slow. Emma's eyes widened in horror as the lamp struck the floor with a sickening thud. The glass cracked, oil spilling onto the wooden planks. And then, a sharp whoosh as the oil caught the small embers still glowing in the hearth. The air filled with the sharp scent of burning oil. Emma's breath hitched. "No, no, no!" The eagle screeched again, flapping wildly, as the dark stain on the floor began to smolder. End of chapter 5. John, still in the barn, heard Emma's scream and the crash that followed. His blood ran cold. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Chapter 6. An eagle in the house. The scent of burning oil filled the air as Emma pressed herself against the wooden wall, her heart pounding against her ribs. The massive eagle flapped wildly in the confined space of the kitchen, its sharp talons scraping against the floorboards, its powerful wings knocking over everything in sight. She barely had time to react before a tin of flour was sent flying, exploding into a white cloud that settled over the broken dishes and shattered glass. The fire. Emma's eyes darted to the dark stain of spilled oil, the faint glow of embers dangerously close. If the flames caught, the whole house could go up in minutes. She had to act. But how? John bursts in. The front door slammed open. "Emma!" John's voice was sharp with fear as he stormed into the house, his boots crunching on broken glass. In his hands, his old pitchfork. Emma turned toward him, eyes wide. "John, the fire!" But before she could finish, the eagle let out a piercing screech and launched itself toward the ceiling. John ducked instinctively as the bird soared, its wings barely missing his head. The old man twisted around, gripping the pitchfork tighter, ready to defend his home. But against what? What was he supposed to do? Fight the bird with farm tools. His eyes darted to the overturned furniture, the burning oil, Emma's panicked face. The house was a disaster, and the worst part? The eagle was just as scared as they were. Collision waiting to happen. The bird, frantic and confused, flapped toward the center of the room, its claws scraping the wooden beams above. Then, crack, its powerful wings slammed into the heavy brass chandelier hanging from the ceiling. Emma let out a strangled gasp as the chandelier swayed dangerously, its chains creaking under the sudden weight. For one terrifying moment, John thought it would come crashing down on them. But the eagle, startled by the impact, veered away just in time, knocking over a wooden shelf instead. More jars shattered. A basket of apples spilled across the floor. The bird landed on the edge of the dining table, wings spread wide, talons digging into the wood. John's grip on the pitchfork tightened. We need to get it out of here before it brings the whole house down. A stubborn intruder. Emma coughed, waving a hand through the flower-filled air. Open the door. John was already moving, kicking a broken chair aside as he flung the front door wide. Cold morning air rushed in, sweeping through the wrecked kitchen. The eagle turned its sharp gaze toward the exit. For a split second, John thought it would take the chance to escape. But instead, the bird ruffled its feathers and stayed put. What the? John muttered. The eagle didn't budge. It was still agitated, its beak slightly open, its golden eyes scanning the room as if looking for something. It wasn't just scared. It was hungry. Clever solution. Emma's mind raced. They couldn't chase it out, they couldn't force it, and trying to fight it would only make things worse. But if it wouldn't leave on its own? John, she said suddenly. The leftover meat. John blinked at her. What? The meat from last night's supper, she exclaimed. It's on the counter. If it's hungry, maybe we can lure it outside. It was worth a try. Emma took a cautious step toward the counter, heart hammering as she reached for the plate of cold roast chicken. The eagle's head snapped toward her, eyes locked on the food. Slowly, carefully, she lifted a piece and tossed it toward the open door. The eagle watched as the meat landed just outside, near the porch steps. It hesitated. John held his breath. Then, with a powerful whoosh of wings, the bird launched itself from the table, soaring straight toward the exit. John barely had time to react before the eagle swooped past him, its massive wings stirring up dust as it snatched the meat midair and disappeared into the morning sky. Silence. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the faint crackling of the smoldering oil. Aftermath of the chaos. John exhaled first, lowering the pitchfork. Well, that was something. Emma let out a shaky laugh, wiping flour from her face. John, look at this place. He did, and what he saw nearly made him groan out loud. The kitchen was in ruins. The table was scratched up, plates shattered, flour and broken glass everywhere. The oil lamp lay in pieces on the floor, and a few embers still smoldered near the fireplace. And the worst part? The old wooden shelf, the one Emma loved so much, was completely destroyed. John sighed, rubbing his forehead. We just saved the cow, and now we have to fix half the house. Emma let out a tired breath. At least we still have a house. John grunted in agreement, then reached for a bucket of water near the door. The fire was small, and with a few quick splashes, it was out. The immediate danger was over. But the mess? That was going to take days to clean up. End of chapter 6. As John leaned against the counter, finally allowing himself a moment to breathe, Emma shook her head with a small smile. Do you think anyone will believe this story? She asked. John chuckled, looking at the chaos around them. I'm not sure I believe it. Chapter 7, The Aftermath. The morning sun poured through the broken window, illuminating the full extent of the chaos. Feathers floated lazily in the air, settling atop every available surface. Flour coated the wooden floor in a fine dusting, mixed with shattered glass, broken plates, and splashes of oil. The overturned chairs, the ruined shelf, the blackened spot where the fire had nearly caught. It was as if a tornado had torn through their cozy kitchen. Emma exhaled, hands on her hips. Well, where do we even begin? John, still clutching the empty bucket, let out a weary chuckle. I'd say we burn the whole place down and start over, but I'm afraid that Eagle might come back to finish the job. Emma shook her head, suppressing a laugh despite the disaster around them. No chance. I doubt he's in a hurry to visit us again. She bent down, picking up a broken plate and sighing. This was from my mother's set. John ran a hand through his hair. We'll find a way to fix what we can, Em. He knelt beside her, helping gather the pieces. Besides, this isn't the first time we've had to clean up a mess like this. Memories in the mess. As they worked, sweeping up glass, scrubbing the floor, and righting the furniture, they couldn't help but reminisce about past disasters. Remember when the piglets got into the house and turned the kitchen into a mud pit? Emma chuckled. John smirked. I remember you slipping in that mud and nearly taking me down with you. Emma huffed. That was your fault for leaving the back door open. John lifted a dustpan full of feathers. And what about the time the goats chewed up half our laundry off the line? I was walking around in holy socks for weeks. Emma laughed. That's because you're too stubborn to throw anything away. John grinned. Well, some things are worth holding on to. Their laughter faded as they finally stood back to survey the now somewhat cleaner kitchen. It wasn't perfect, but it was livable again. Emma stretched her aching back. All right, that's enough for now. Let's check on Belka. John nodded, grabbing his coat. Good idea. If we're lucky, she's still standing. A familiar problem returns. The barn was peaceful compared to the morning's chaos. Belka stood in her stall, chewing slowly on a mouthful of hay. She still looked weak, but there was a calmness about her now. No more strained breathing, no more desperate struggling. John patted her side. Good girl. Emma, relieved, leaned against the wooden fence. At least one thing is going right today. But then, a flurry of movement in the yard caught John's eye. Emma followed his gaze and her stomach dropped. The ducks. They were at it again. A group of frantic little chicks scattered in all directions, their tiny wings flapping desperately as 3 determined ducks chased after them with alarming speed. John muttered a curse under his breath. That's it. This has to stop. Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. We can't keep letting this happen, John. Those poor chicks don't stand a chance. John nodded. We need a real solution. Something that ends this for good. Plan is made. Back at the house, they sat at the kitchen table discussing their options. Maybe they need more space, Emma suggested. If we build a bigger enclosure. John shook his head. It won't work. They keep finding ways out. Emma frowned. Then what do? We can't just get rid of them. They're part of the farm. John sighed. I know, but if they keep this up, we might not have a choice. They fell into a heavy silence. Neither of them liked the idea of rehoming the ducks, but what other choice did they have? Finally, Emma stood. Let's sleep on it. Maybe we'll think clearer in the morning. John rubbed his tired eyes. Yeah, maybe, but just as they were getting ready to turn in for the night, a loud, frantic barking echoed from the neighbor's yard. An unexpected turn. John and Emma rushed to the porch, peering over the fence toward their neighbor's land. What they saw made their jaws drop. The ducks, those same mischievous, aggressive birds, were no longer chasing the chicks. They were chasing something else. The neighbor's dog, a big, burly shepherd mix, was running for its life. The poor animal yelped and darted across the yard, pursued by a furious squad of quacking, flapping, downright terrifying ducks. John blinked. Well, I didn't see that coming. Emma covered her mouth, torn between horror and laughter. Oh dear, what is wrong with these ducks? John just shook his head. Looks like we're not the only ones with a problem anymore. Chapter 8, Showdown with the Ducks. The early morning mist still hung over the farm when the angry knock came at the door. John groaned, rubbing his tired eyes. After the chaos of the last few days, he had hoped for a moment of peace. No such luck. Emma, still tying her apron, shot him a look. "That'll be Henry," John sighed. Yep, their neighbor, Henry Carter, was not a man of patience. And judging by the force of his knocking, he wasn't in a friendly mood. An angry neighbor. John opened the door to find Henry standing there, his face red with frustration. His usually well-groomed dog, Rusty, stood beside him, looking utterly miserable, his thick fur matted with mud. "Morning, Henry," John said, trying for a neutral tone. Henry wasted no time. "Morning? Morning. John, your damn ducks nearly took my dog's tail off." Emma stepped beside John, concern etched on her face. "Oh dear. Is he hurt?" Henry crossed his arms. "A few scratches. But that's not the point. He's terrified. Rusty won't even go near your fence now. I had to drag him out of the house." John scratched the back of his head. "I won't lie to you, Henry. We know we've got a problem." Henry huffed. "Well, you better fix it before I come back with a real complaint." John nodded. "We'll handle it. See that you do," Henry muttered, turning on his heel and leading Rusty away. The poor dog cast one last nervous glance at the farm before disappearing behind the fence. Emma sighed, closing the door. "We can't keep putting this off, John. We need a real solution, a last attempt at peace." They spent the morning devising a plan. "We've been treating this like an aggression problem," Emma mused, flipping through an old farming book. "But what if it's not? What if something else is making them act this way?" John frowned. "Like what?" Emma tapped her chin. "Stress, territory disputes, lack of food." John folded his arms. "So what do you suggest? A duck therapist?" Emma shot him a look. "I suggest we change things up. We give them more space, a different feeding routine, and see what happens." John sighed but nodded. "All right, one last chance." They spent the day making adjustments. The ducks' enclosure was expanded, giving them more room to roam. Their feeding schedule was changed, offering them food more frequently to prevent competition. They added distractions, fresh water baths, piles of straw, even an old wooden log for perching. By the afternoon, there was a noticeable shift. The ducks weren't pacing aggressively near the chicks anymore. They seemed calmer. John allowed himself a breath of relief. "Maybe this is working." Emma smiled. "I told you. Sometimes all it takes is a little—" A sudden quack cut her off. They turned just in time to see it. One of the larger ducks, a particularly mean-looking drake, had broken away from the group, and it was charging straight at a lone chick. The plan fails. "Not again," John cursed, running forward. The chick barely had time to react before the duck lunged, beak open. But before the attack could land, whack! Emma's broom swung down, blocking the duck mid-charge. It flapped back, hissing, wings flaring wide in defiance. John moved beside her, scowling. "That's it. No more experiments. These ducks are trouble." Emma bit her lip, disappointed but not surprised. "I hoped we could fix this, John. I really did." John exhaled. "I know." They exchanged a heavy look. The decision they had been avoiding was now unavoidable. Either the ducks went or the rest of the farm suffered. John took off his hat, rubbing his temple. "I'll talk to Henry. Maybe he knows someone who'll take them." Emma hesitated. "Before we do anything, I want to check something." John frowned. "Check what?" Emma's brow furrowed. "I don't know yet. Just a feeling." And with that, she turned and headed toward the old barn. An unexpected discovery. The barn was one of the oldest buildings on their farm, used mostly for storage now. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams of afternoon light streaming through the cracks in the wooden walls. Emma stepped inside, her boots creaking against the floorboards. Something had been nagging at her ever since the duck's behavior changed, a gut feeling she couldn't shake. She scanned the barn, looking for anything out of place. Then, in the farthest corner, behind a stack of old wooden crates, she spotted it. A nest, a large, well-hidden nest. And inside, a clutch of eggs. Emma's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just any nest. This was a duck's nest. And suddenly, it all made sense. The aggression, the territorial behavior, the relentless chasing of the chicks. These ducks weren't just being mean. They were protecting something. Chapter 9. The Secret of the Aggressive Ducks. The barn was silent except for the soft shuffle of Emma's boots across the floorboards. She crouched down, staring at the nest she had uncovered. The more she looked at it, the more she realized just how well hidden it had been. It was tucked away in the farthest corner of the barn, under an old, weathered tarp. The surrounding crates and barrels had shielded it from sight. The eggs inside the nest were warm to the touch, though they had clearly been there for some time. They were large and smooth, their shells pale with specks of brown. Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing. "John," she called softly, not taking her eyes off the nest. John entered the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. "What is it, Em?" Emma straightened, pointing toward the nest. "Look at this. Those eggs. They're from the ducks." John knelt down beside her, his eyes widening. "That's why they've been acting so strange. They're protecting their nest." Emma nodded slowly. "I think you're right. They're not being aggressive out of malice. They're defending their future. It's instinct." John sighed, rubbing his chin. "Well, that explains a lot, but it doesn't make it any easier for the chicks. Or the dog." Emma frowned. "We need to move the eggs somewhere safer." John looked around the barn, then at the surrounding yard. "I'm not sure it's safe to keep them here. With those ducks on edge, it's a risk to everyone." Emma stood up, resolve hardening in her gaze. "Let's move them to the stable. It's secure and quiet. The ducks won't feel threatened there." A risky move. The process wasn't easy. They gathered the eggs gently, one by one, and placed them into a large basket lined with soft hay. Emma handled them carefully, her heart racing with every shift. She couldn't bear the thought of harming them by accident. John carried the basket to the stable, following Emma closely. The ducks quacked and flapped angrily at their heels as they moved, but Emma and John ignored them, focusing on their goal. Once they arrived at the stable, they set the eggs down in a quiet corner, away from the bustle of the barn. Emma arranged the hay around them, ensuring they would stay warm and secure. "We'll leave them here for a while," Emma said softly. "It's the best we can do." John nodded, though his expression was troubled. "I hope this works. I really do." A change in behavior. Over the next few days, the ducks' behavior started to shift. At first, they were cautious, but the more time passed, the more they seemed to settle. They no longer chased the chicks with such fury. They were still protective, but now their aggression was tempered with a noticeable calmness. John and Emma continued to observe them carefully, noting the changes. The ducks weren't perfect, but at least they were no longer a threat to the rest of the animals. One afternoon, Emma noticed a subtle difference. "John, look, do you see that?" John turned to follow her gaze. The ducks were near the stable, but they were no longer on edge. Instead, they were standing in a line, heads turned toward the corner where the eggs had been moved. There was a sense of peaceful anticipation about them. "They know," Emma said, her voice full of wonder. "They sensed the change." John smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. "It looks like we might have done the right thing after all." The first crack. Then, one morning, as the sun began to rise, Emma heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound. A small crack. She rushed to the stable, John following close behind, to find the source of the noise. There, nestled in the soft hay, one of the eggs had begun to split open. A tiny crack ran along the side, and inside, a beak was beginning to push through. Emma gasped. "John, look!" John bent down, his heart racing. "It's happening. The eggs are hatching." They watched in awe as the tiny duckling pushed its way out of the egg, wet and trembling, its yellow feathers damp from the egg's contents. Emma reached down to gently pick it up, her eyes shining with emotion. "Look at him," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "A brand new life." The tiny duckling blinked up at her, its eyes wide and curious. It let out a soft quack, and Emma laughed, tears pricking her eyes. "We've got babies, John. We've got babies." John smiled, a wide grin spreading across his face. I didn't think I'd be so happy about ducks. But this is something special, a new beginning. Over the following days, more eggs began to hatch, one by one, revealing tiny ducklings with soft, yellow down. The ducks were no longer as aggressive. Their focus was entirely on their new brood, and they no longer showed signs of hostility toward the other animals. It seemed the storm had passed, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. She watched as one of the female ducks, the one that had seemed the most protective, lingered near the corner of the stable, eyeing the other animals with suspicion. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her uneasy. Chapter 10. Peace returns. The soft cluck of ducklings echoed through the air as John and Emma sat quietly on the porch. Their farm, once filled with tension and worry, now seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The new life on the farm was a welcome sight, tiny, yellow ducklings waddling after their mothers, their fluffy feathers catching the sunlight in a perfect, idyllic moment. Emma smiled, watching them chase each other around, their small beaks pecking at the ground. "Look at them," she murmured, resting her head on John's shoulder. "They're so small, so full of life." John smiled, his hand finding hers. "It's been a wild ride, hasn't it? But I think we've finally made it through." Emma nodded, though a small frown creased her brow. "I've never been so grateful for a peaceful moment in all my life." There was a sense of contentment between them, the kind that only comes from hard-earned peace. They had fought battles with the ducks, saved their cow, endured an attack by an eagle, and now they were watching their little farm come alive with the hum of nature. Meanwhile, in the barn, the last of the eggs had hatched. The ducks, once so frantic and territorial, now preened and fussed over their young ones, no longer a threat to the rest of the farm. They'd accepted their new surroundings, their new rhythm, and for the first time in weeks, Emma felt like they could finally breathe easy. Belka's recovery. Across the yard, Belka, the cow who had been so gravely ill just days ago, now stood tall and strong. She grazed peacefully, her sides rising and falling with each calm breath. Her fur was glossy, her eyes bright and alert. "She's doing well," John said, his voice filled with pride. "I thought we might lose her, but she's bounced back stronger than ever." Emma watched the cow for a moment longer, her heart swelling with relief. "She's a fighter, just like us." John chuckled. "That she is. We could all learn something from her." It was true. Belka had faced her own battle much like they had, and she had won, just like them, the eagle's last visit. There had been no sign of the eagle since that terrifying night. No more crashes, no more broken windows. The old house was finally free from that menace. But John and Emma weren't taking any chances. Every evening, before retiring for the night, they carefully secured all the windows, making sure that everything was tightly closed. They didn't want to risk another surprise visit from the bird. John checked the last window, gave Emma a reassuring look, and they settled in for the night. "No more surprises, I hope," he muttered with a smile. Emma laughed softly. "You never know, John. Life on the farm is never dull." But tonight, at least, they could rest easy. The worst seemed to be behind them, the reality of farm life. As the days passed, Emma and John both realized something profound. Life on the farm was not a simple, easy existence. It was full of surprises, some welcome, some not, but it was always challenging. The animals needed constant care, and the work never seemed to end. The weather could turn in an instant, the crops could fail, and unexpected crises could arise at any moment. But despite it all, they had found a rhythm. They had learned to adjust, to adapt, and most importantly, to survive. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" Emma said one evening, as they sat together, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the darkening sky. John gave a tired but contented nod. "We have, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." Emma looked at him, her eyes warm. "Me neither." They had built something here, something real, something that belonged to them. The final moment of peace. As the sun set over the rolling fields, casting a warm golden glow over the farm, Emma and John leaned back in their rocking chairs, side by side. The air was cool, a soft breeze rustling the trees, and for a moment, They allowed themselves to simply be. They didn't speak. There was no need for words. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, no doubt. The farm never stopped demanding. But for now, in this quiet moment, they were content. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the evening. The gentle clucking of ducks, the occasional moo from Belka, the faint rustling of leaves. It was a peaceful symphony, the music of a life well lived, a life full of its own stories and challenges. Then, from the distance, came a strange sound, something rustling, like someone was moving about in the barn. John frowned and sat up straight. "Did you hear that?" Emma turned her head toward the barn, her expression thoughtful. "I did. What could it be?" The sound was soft but unmistakable. A rustling in the hay, like something or someone was stirring. John stood up slowly. "Let's go see. We don't want any more surprises." They walked toward the barn, the peaceful calm of the evening suddenly interrupted by this new mystery. What could be causing that sound? Was it an animal or something else? But that, of course, was a story for another day.